Imagine if Africa stopped seeking approval, if it seized the pen and rewrote the rules of power. Picture a continent no longer pausing for permission, but blazing its own trail, undeterred by the weight of history or the skepticism of distant capitals. For more than 100 years, the world's strongest nations split Africa like a prize, drawing invisible lines to keep it divided and powerless. Paris, Washington, and Brussels set the terms, making sure no African country could truly stand alone or unite with its neighbors. The continent, rich in culture and resources, was treated less as a community of nations and more as a chessboard, its squares drawn without regard for the people who lived atop them. But in January of 2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger did the unimaginable. Together, they erased their colonial borders, forging a single identity: one nation, one military, one flag. 3 states, long dismissed as fragile and irrelevant, declared the old map dead. Their pronouncement was not just administrative. It was a defiant act of historical correction, a declaration that the era of being told who they were and what they could aspire to was finally over. Consider the Berlin Conference of the year 1884, where not a single African leader was present. There, European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and Italy, sat around a table and dissected Africa as if it were a cake. Their rulers used ink and ambition to dictate new realities, disregarding centuries-old kingdoms, alliances, and trade networks. Imagine families whose villages had straddled the same river for generations, suddenly finding themselves separated by a line that existed only on a foreign map. This was not just a matter of geography. It was an act of social engineering that would reverberate for more than a century. Let's uncover what truly happened and why it reverberates far beyond Africa. The world's reaction was instant. Paris, Washington, and Brussels were blindsided. This was not a reckless gamble, but a calculated bid to reclaim power, resources, and dignity stolen for generations. Think of the moment in 1947, when India gained independence and the world had to recalibrate its perceptions. Or recall the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, when a single act of unity sent shockwaves across continents. The Sahel Alliance's move belonged in this lineage of world-changing events, unexpected, audacious, and impossible to ignore. Why does it matter? Because when the supposedly weak unite, they can upend the very system that confined them. Ignore this story, and you risk missing how global power is being rewritten and how unity can break centuries-old chains. The implications stretch far beyond Africa. The world's supply of uranium, gold, and critical minerals now faces new terms, new faces at the negotiating table, and new rules written by those who own the land. Before the world reached the year 2025, Africa's fate was mapped not in its own villages, but in distant foreign capitals. The borders slicing across the Sahel were not born from rivers, mountains, or the shared stories of its people. Instead, they were the scars left by a gathering in Berlin in the year 1884, a meeting where European powers coolly divided the continent, blind to those whose lives and histories they uprooted. To grasp the roots of this seismic shift, we must first travel back to the moment Africa's borders were drawn at a European table. Only then can we understand what it means to erase them. Imagine the scene in Berlin: long tables, maps unfurled, powerful men in dark suits arguing over rivers and deserts they had never seen. The decisions made in those days were not abstract. They created the blueprint for more than 140 years of conflict, confusion, and missed opportunity. Among all, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger bore this burden most acutely. Labeled weak, hammered by sanctions, and kept dependent on foreign aid, they were often dismissed as mere pawns in a much larger game. Every crisis, every insurgency, every economic downturn brought the same tired prescription: more foreign troops, more outside pressure, and more strings tied to every crumb of support. In the 1970s and 1980s, when drought struck the Sahel, foreign aid arrived, but so did new debts and tighter controls. military bases mushroomed. French and American soldiers patrolled borders that the locals had never recognized as real. To ignore this legacy was to guarantee its repetition. Without confronting these colonial chains, without daring to redraw the borders designed to weaken them, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger saw no path to true independence. Their dignity and destiny remained hostage to an old order, one that thrived on their fragmentation. The lesson was harsh but clear. As long as Africa played by rules it did not write, it would always come last. This colonial scramble tore tribes apart, made neighbors into strangers, and strangled ancient trade routes that once pulsed through Africa's heart. In the Sahel, ancient empires such as Ghana, Mali, and Songhai had thrived on exchange and cooperation. The new borders, however, turned bustling caravan routes into hostile frontiers. Families who had traded salt and gold for centuries were now separated by checkpoints and tariffs. The lines drawn to serve distant empires became invisible walls, trapping millions and choking any hope of unity. True African solidarity was not merely discouraged, it was engineered to be impossible. For more than 140 years, these artificial borders outlasted the empires that birthed them, casting a long, unbroken shadow over every new dream of cooperation. But on the 15th of January, 2025, the Sahel refused to be caged any longer. Overnight, everything changed. There are moments in history when change arrives not as a gradual tide, but as a lightning bolt. The announcement from Ouagadougou was one such moment, a rupture in the old script. Yet decades of intrusion and dependency did not crush the spirit of the Sahel. They fueled a quiet, growing rage. The people watched as their gold, cotton, and uranium flowed abroad, while promises of development dissolved and leaders were told to seek approval from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. What emerged was not partnership, but a suffocating cycle, one that condemned generation after generation to poverty, division, and borrowed dignity. Young people in Bamako dreamed of jobs in Europe because there were too few opportunities at home. Farmers in Niamey sold crops at a loss while multinational companies shipped profits overseas. It became clear, as long as the old borders and old contracts held sway, real change would remain out of reach. When borders dissolved, the world's certainties and its markets quaked. Financial analysts scrambled to adjust their models. Diplomats in Brussels and Washington convened emergency meetings. The move was not simply symbolic. It threatened to reset the global balance of power and to inspire similar uprisings elsewhere. In the gray dawn, as the world watched in disbelief, the leaders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger stepped forward with a declaration that would shake the foundations of global power. They called it the Sahel Alliance, and it was more than just a pact. It was a promise to reclaim Africa's future. It was a message to every African: your destiny is no longer written in foreign tongues. On a cold January afternoon in the year 2025, the presidents of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger signed a single, startling declaration. Overnight, 3 nations merged into one, the Sahel superstate. They raised a new flag, forged a united army, and spoke with one voice for 70 million citizens, charting a future no longer dictated by outsiders. This was the birth of a new nation, one that would not have been possible without the courage to break with the past. The tremors spread far beyond the Sahel. In the south, Botswana demanded an equal share of diamond profits, rejecting the old lopsided deals that left only a quarter for locals. The Democratic Republic of the Congo launched new trade routes, bypassing foreign-controlled corridors and keeping more value on African land. In West Africa, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire began talks on coordinating cocoa exports to set fair prices, inspired by the Sahel's boldness. The world watched stunned as centuries-old lines vanished and the map of Africa shifted. This alliance was more than a symbol. Together, the Sahel bloc now commanded more than 1/3 of the world's uranium reserves, along with vast gold and oil fields. That was enough leverage to rattle energy markets and threaten the dominance of foreign interests. For context, uranium powers nuclear plants from France to China. Gold underpins global finance. Oil fuels industries on every continent. This was not a regional story. It was a global turning point. The Sahel leaders wasted no time. Old contracts, especially those that had handed control of Niger's uranium to French corporations, were torn up or forced into renegotiation. For the first time, the wealth beneath Sahel soil was reclaimed for its own people, not distant shareholders in Paris or London. The alliance demanded new terms, higher royalties, local jobs, and technology transfers. When French mining giant Areva balked, the alliance threatened to nationalize its operations. The shockwaves were felt in European boardrooms and African villages alike. The global backlash was immediate and fierce. Europe and the United States imposed sweeping sanctions, froze development funds, and unleashed a torrent of dire headlines, warning of impending chaos. Yet the pressure only drew the Sahel nations closer. They negotiated as a bloc, opened borders to African travelers, and struck direct deals from Dakar to Kinshasa, weaving a new Pan-African network. Russian, Turkish, and Chinese delegations arrived with offers of investment that bypassed Western strings. But rewriting the rules and reclaiming dignity sparked both jubilation and fierce resistance from within and far beyond Africa's borders. In the streets of Bamako and Ouagadougou, crowds celebrated with music, parades, and a newfound confidence. Yet in the halls of power in Paris and Brussels, the mood was one of alarm. Could this alliance really hold? As the world reeled from the Sahel's audacity, the alliance's leaders confronted a harsher reality. Unity brought not just hope, but new threats, both visible and hidden. The lessons of history loomed large. Revolutions spark counter-revolutions. The fate of the Sahel alliance would depend on its ability to weather storms both old and new. The stakes had never been higher. If the alliance collapsed, Africa would remain a supplier of cheap resources to distant powers. But if it held, it could shift the balance of global power and inspire a wave of economic independence and dignity across the continent. The world's commodity markets held their breath. In London and New York, the price of uranium spiked. Energy companies in Europe scrambled to secure new contracts. Across Africa, millions watched the news, wondering if this was the moment the continent would finally reclaim its voice. Unity brought unprecedented freedoms, but also summoned new adversaries and unfamiliar tests. Just as the United States faced internal discord after its revolution, or as the European Union struggled with divergent interests after its formation, the Sahel Alliance now faced the challenge of forging one nation from three distinct societies. Yet, far beyond the new borders, the world was watching, and not all eyes watched in hope. Western capitals saw the alliance as a threat to the old order. Diplomats talked of instability. Aid was suspended, loans withdrawn, and sanctions targeted at key ministers, banks, and industries. In Western media, headlines painted the alliance as reckless, even dangerous. Every achievement was minimized, every setback amplified, until doubt seemed to fill the air. Echoes of past interventions, such as the embargoes on Cuba or Iran, reminded the alliance of the dangers of isolation. Under this mounting pressure, the three leaders, President Traoré, Colonel Goita, and General Tiani, did not waver. Instead, they stood shoulder to shoulder, issuing coordinated responses, hosting joint press conferences, and openly seeking new partnerships. Delegations from Russia, Turkey, China, and the BRICS bloc arrived in quick succession, each eager to offer alternatives to Western finance and technology. The alliance's message was uncompromising. They would not be bullied back into isolation. The leaders cited the non-aligned movement of the 1960s as inspiration, a coalition of countries refusing to be pawns in great power games. In the weeks that followed the formal birth of the Sahel Alliance, ordinary life began to transform in ways unseen for generations. Borders, once carved by colonial rulers, severing families and suffocating trade, simply vanished. For the first time in living memory, citizens of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso traveled, traded, and studied across the old lines as if those divisions had never existed. Bustling markets sprang up where checkpoints once stood. Families, long separated by paperwork and politics, embraced. Students crossed into neighboring cities for study exchanges that would have been unthinkable only months before. Imagine a merchant from Niamey selling millet in Bamako without tariffs or bribes. A young woman from Ouagadougou enrolling in a university in Timbuktu. A family reunion decades in the making, no longer disrupted by border guards. But the gravest threat did not come from abroad, it emerged from within. As the flush of unity faded, the realities of merging three nations became clear. Different legal codes, languages, and administrative systems clashed. Critics, some genuine, some with foreign sponsors, questioned everything from the structure of a shared military to the fairness of economic integration. Protests flared, fueled by non-governmental organizations with opaque funding. Social media teemed with rumors that the leaders were secretly rivals, that cultural divisions would soon tear the alliance apart. The lessons of South Sudan, where unity quickly unraveled, served as a cautionary tale. Disinformation spread like Harmattan dust. Fake news sites screamed of secret betrayals and rising crime. Whisper networks claimed one country would soon dominate the others. The intent was clear: fracture the alliance before it could set its roots. Foreign intelligence services, remembering the role of misinformation in destabilizing Yugoslavia in the 1990s, sought to sow confusion and mistrust. The stakes could not have been higher. If internal divisions took hold, the dream of unity would collapse, and with it, Africa's long-awaited chance to reclaim its destiny. But if the alliance endured, it would send a message to the world: sabotage and division are not Africa's fate. Instead, the continent could write its own story, even in the face of adversity. By meeting both external sabotage and internal tension head-on, the Sahel Alliance was discovering its real strength. For the first time, the rest of Africa watched, not with skepticism, but with a flicker of hope. In Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, commentators began to debate: could this experiment work? Could it spread? Yet, the Sahel Alliance chose a different path. Instead of hiding their disagreements, the leaders laid them bare. Budgets were published in full. Council meetings and debates were live-streamed. Cameras captured both argument and agreement. Critics were given a stage, but so was the vision of unity. To tackle disputes and manage resources, the alliance established the Sahel Council, a new body for shared governance and oversight. Its sessions were broadcast for all to see, building a fragile but growing sense of participation and trust that no outside power could easily undermine. This radical transparency echoed the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of post-apartheid South Africa, which prioritized open dialogue over secrecy. How did three supposedly fragile nations overturn their fate? And what can we learn from their audacity? But the road ahead was anything but certain. As the alliance faced its first true crisis, the world waited to see whether unity would hold or unravel. The pressures of merging economies, aligning legal systems, and managing ethnic diversity were daunting. Yet, every day the alliance survived, it chipped away at the myth that Africa could not govern itself. The Sahel Alliance, forged by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, proves that strategic, visible leadership can alter history. Leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Tiani were not distant rulers. They appeared at the barricades, spoke directly to their people, explained every policy, and began restoring faith in institutions weakened by decades of foreign interference. Their leadership style echoed the hands-on approaches of Nelson Mandela in South Africa and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, leaders who understood that revolution demands both vision and presence. If there is a single lesson for any nation seeking to reclaim its destiny, it is this: hands-on leadership cannot be replaced. These presidents did not hide behind bureaucracy or vague promises. They made difficult choices in public, accepted personal risk, and showed that true transformation requires ordinary citizens to witness and feel change for themselves. In town halls and on radio broadcasts, they answered questions, addressed criticisms, and encouraged participation. This was governance as conversation, not command. This shift did not go unchallenged. The world's most powerful capitals answered with sanctions, travel bans, and efforts to fracture the alliance from within. Yet both leaders and ordinary people understood that patient, coordinated action could withstand even the harshest external pressure. Refusing to yield to intimidation or isolation, the alliance only grew more determined, and with every crisis, its unity became a shield against sabotage and despair. The lesson: real change is not won in a day, but in the daily choice to persevere. Another lesson is even sharper. Africa's vast wealth, its gold, uranium, oil, and fertile land, can only be protected through unity and direct negotiation. For generations, foreign middlemen dictated the terms, leaving behind only poverty and dependence. By uniting at one negotiating table, dissolving artificial borders, and bargaining as a single bloc, the Sahel Alliance turned the tables. Suddenly, the globe's strongest powers had no choice but to negotiate with Africa on equal footing. This echoed the formation of OPEC in the 1960s, when oil-rich nations realized their collective power and began to set their own prices. But even as the alliance gained momentum, new threats began to emerge from unexpected quarters. The question became, could unity survive the next test? Borders once meant barriers, but in the Sahel, they became bridges because ordinary people and determined leaders refused to wait for permission. In marketplaces from Niamey to Bamako, traders discovered new customers and new freedoms. In villages near the old frontiers, families reunited. The scars of colonial division began to heal, not through abstract policy, but through daily acts of courage and cooperation. The real danger for Africa and all who are watching is letting this moment slip away. Fail to learn from the Sahel Alliance, and we risk losing the blueprint for breaking out of cycles of exploitation and recovering dignity, wealth, and future control. History is full of missed opportunities, moments when bold experiments faltered and old powers regained their grip. The Sahel story is a warning and an invitation. The future belongs to those who seize it. Perhaps the most quietly radical step was the creation of new institutions, especially the Sahel Council. By insisting on transparency and collective oversight, they kept out political saboteurs and foreign agents. Open debates and shared authority left little room for the old machinery of corruption or manipulation to creep back in. The structure of the Sahel Council, with representatives from each member nation and a rotating presidency, ensured that no single state could dominate. Decisions required consensus, not coercion. For Africa's youth, the Sahel Alliance became a living model, a movement built on action and results, not empty slogans. Pan-Africanism was no longer a distant dream, but a public process, unfolding before their eyes. The message to future leaders across the continent and to the world was unmistakable. Self-determination means more than demanding respect. It means building systems resilient enough to resist outside interference. Schools in Bamako began teaching the history of the movement. Universities in Niamey held seminars on the mechanics of integration, and young entrepreneurs found new opportunities in cross-border markets. For more than 100 years, Africa was told to accept its assigned place, to remain inside boundaries etched by foreign hands. But in the year 2025, these nations shredded the colonial script. They erased lines meant to divide and wrote a new story of shared purpose, shared power, and a future owned by Africans themselves. It was as much a cultural revolution as a political one. This was not reckless defiance. It was measured, strategic, and urgently necessary. By dissolving the old borders and joining forces, they forced the world to recognize a new reality. Africa is not a playground for outsiders. It is a force with its own will, its own resources, and a vision shaped by its own people. The message reverberated from the smallest village to the grandest capital. The time of waiting is over. If you see this as just another geopolitical shuffle, you are missing the real story. The rules are being rewritten, not just the players. The Sahel Alliance is not simply a new block on a map. It is living proof that collective action can silence the echo of colonialism and reclaim dignity in the 21st century. It is a case study for all who believe that change is impossible, that destiny is fixed, or that the weak must always bow to the strong. What unfolded in the Sahel is not just a twist in a dusty history book. It is a living lesson for anyone daring to break from the old order. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger drew a line, not to separate, but to unite. They showed that unity is not a privilege bestowed by distant powers, but a right seized through courage and collective resolve. Their experiment recalls other bold breakaways, the unification of Germany in the 19th century, or the birth of the European Union after World War II. Each proved that history can be changed by those who refuse to accept a broken present. This lesson stretches far beyond the Sahel. For anyone who has ever been told to wait their turn or follow the old rules, the message is unambiguous. Change does not require permission. It demands resolve, solidarity, and the courage to envision something better. The world is watching, not just to see if the alliance will endure, but to see if others will follow. The stakes are immense. A united Africa means wealth staying on the continent, politics shaped by its own citizens, and a future decided by those who live there. It is a warning to old powers and a beacon of hope for everyone else. The era of outsiders dictating Africa's destiny is drawing to a close. The time has come for Africa to write its own story and for the world to listen.